Hello and welcome to Mostly Vintage Cameras. This is a Mark II Agfa Isolette made throughout the 1950s. It was one of a long range of Isolette cameras which were made all the way from 1937 through to the early 1960s. The Mark II was one of the more modestly specified cameras, but nonetheless a very nicely made thing which we should take a closer look at. So let's do that. So starting at the front, there's not much going on here. Very nice stylish leatherette finish, which even after all these years is in remarkably good condition. Chrome top plate, little window for the viewfinder, and you'll notice the viewfinder is in line with where the lens will be when we open the camera up, and that means we're only getting parallax error in the vertical plane, not the horizontal plane as well. So parallax error, of course, is where the viewfinder is up here and sees one thing, and the lens is down here and sees another thing. So if you're close up to a subject, your lens might see this, for example, but your viewfinder, which is a little bit higher, might see that. And that's the classic way in which people cut people's heads off in photographs and that sort of thing that you might remember from your childhood photographs. But anyway, moving on, that's the front of the camera. On this side, there's not a lot going on. We've just got a catch for the door, for the film door. On the rear, a little bit more exciting, more very nice leatherette finish. We've got a window for viewing the frame number, the viewfinder itself, a time exposure switch, which we'll come back to in a little bit, a hot shoe, or an accessory shoe I should say. It's not actually a hot shoe, there's no electrical connection. And then on the other side we've got the hinge for the film door. The base plate, again not a lot going on here, 2 feet to make it stable so it'll stand upright, and a very nicely finished tripod thread, standard 1/4 inch tripod thread there, Whitworth thread. So to the top plate, this is where all the action happens as far as the camera exterior goes. This opens the camera up. That's the shutter button. This is the film wind, and it's worth noting this little spot here. This is the film wind interlock with the shutter, so the camera has a mechanism that prevents you from taking 2 photographs on 1 frame of film, which is quite handy. And over here, although we don't have a rangefinder, we do have a depth of field scale, which again we'll take a closer look at in a little while. So let's do the exciting thing with these cameras. We push this button here and the lens board pops open to reveal the lens, and it's really around the lens itself that all the action happens. So this type of camera, which has a sprung loaded lens board, and we'll just take a closer look at that, push that, and I'm doing this gently because it is an old mechanism, but you see that the lens springs forward on its bellows. These are known as self-erecting bellows cameras, rather amusingly. So on the lens barrel we have focusing, we have the mechanism to cock the shutter, we have in this dial, which is marked here, the shutter speed indicator, and throughout the production of the Mark II and most of the Isolettes, the type of lens, the type of shutter and some other specifications did change a little bit depending on what parts are available to the factory at any given time. So if you have an Isolette Mark II, it may have a different lens or a different shutter to this one. But nonetheless, we'll move on. There's a thread here to take a cable release, and then lastly your aperture scale or aperture selector is on the top here. I say lastly, there's also a socket for an electronic flash unit. So that's the camera control layout. We can see that this has an Agnar, I think it's an 85mm, that's quite long in fact, 85mm f4.5. So with shutter speeds only 3, 25th, a 50th and 200ths of a second, and a maximum aperture of f4.5, this is obviously not going to be a top of the range camera, and it has a basic Vario shutter, not an SVS or one of the slightly posher shutters that some Isolettes had. But nonetheless, let's go about taking a photograph. So as we wind on, you'll hear a little grinding and clicking. I've already cocked the shutter, and when I press the button, you'll see the shutter releases. And now I can't take another photograph, even if I cock the shutter. It won't allow me to take a second picture. And you'll see the little window here, or you may be able to see the little dot here, has turned red. That warns me that I need to wind on before I can take the next picture. Now that's turned chrome, I can trip the shutter, but I need to be aware of the film window here. This tells me how many photographs I've taken. And there's no automatic stop on this. I just wind until the number of the next frame appears in this window. So that's fairly straightforward. So once the next frame's in shot, I can take the next photograph. And that's really all there is to it. There's no light meter, there's no coupled rangefinder. So when it comes to setting focusing distance, you either have to guess and rely on depth of field, or you have to use an external rangefinder. There's no exposure meter. There was a version, the Isolette L, which did have a light meter built in, but this doesn't. So again, it's an external meter or guessing, Sunny 16 rule, that sort of thing. Let's just take a closer look at this depth of field scale. So you don't see this on too many cameras, but what we've got is our aperture values around the outer ring and a distance scale on the inner ring. So if we're focused at, let's say, 6 feet and we're using an aperture of f8, if I align f8 with 6 feet, then what it's telling me is that the nearer distance, you see this little engraved line, everything from 5 feet up to just under 8 feet should be acceptably sharp. So that gives you a little guide as to how much depth of field you're going to have. But I'm going to fold this camera up and we'll take a look inside. One thing I've noticed about this is how nicely finished everything is. You can see there's this checker plate style finish here, nice shiny chromium. There's no sort of foam rubber light traps on this. The only light trap on it is a strip of felt along here. That's never going to perish. Well, the glue might come apart, but it's never going to perish. So the format of this camera is a 6x6 centimetre, or 2 1/4 square inch if you're that way inclined. What we used to call a 12 on, so you get 12 photographs on a roll of 120 film. Some of the earlier Isolettes actually had a switch where you could switch from shooting 6x6 to 6x4/5, and on those cameras they have 2 windows. One will reveal the frame number of a 12 on frame and the other for a 16 on, or a 6x4/5, and you had to refer, you chose which format you use at the start of the roll of the film, and you had to remember to refer to the correct frame counting window. Film loading on this is pretty easy. You put the empty spool in the take-up. What makes it easy is this fold-out film holder. So this folds out and actually springs up a little bit. So it's a lot easier to get your roll of film into the spool there, or into the spool holder. Again, just a nice little feature. And there's one last thing on this camera that I haven't mentioned. Not every Isolette, not even every Isolette Mk II has a time exposure switch. So let's take a look at bulb time. So if I set the shutter to bulb and I cock the shutter, when I press the button, having wound on, there we go. If I hold the button down, the shutter stays open until I release it again. And you can see there I've left the window cover for the rear frame counter open, so you can see the red glow there. I release the shutter, and there we go, that's our exposure done. But it is a bit tedious keeping the button held down. So if we activate the time mode by moving that over, I'm still in bulb. When I press the button, the shutter opens, and it stays open until I release the time switch at the back. And that really is all there is to it. I do have some photographs that were taken with this, which is just a test roll. These were taken on Ilford Ortho film, which is quite an interesting film in its own right. You're not going to be able to see a lot on these negatives. This is my favourite on the roll, where we can see some kind of shrub with berries on coming into bloom. And here we can see that 85mm lens. It's a standard lens on 6x6 cameras, but we've got very shallow depth of field, and the bokeh's particularly nice. Other things we can note, if we look at the edge markings of the film, there's no sign of any fogging. This camera is totally light proof after all these years, which is down to that nice fit and finish on the production. As you would expect from a camera where you're relying on the markings on the roll of film itself, the gaps between each negative are correct, evenly spaced. So let's take a closer look at a couple of these photographs and see what the quality is like. Just before we do that, you might be thinking I'm not handling these negatives very carefully. And you're right, I'm not, simply because this is a roll of film to test the camera, and they'll be going in the bin after I've shot this video. So let's take a look at a couple of these photographs in more detail. We've got some slightly scary looking trees here. Doesn't really tell you a great deal about the camera, but it gives you an indication of sharpness. Then we've got a little longer distance scene where we can see the sort of tonal graduation that the lens is capable of. Again, not remarkable photographs, but they just give an indication of what you can expect. And as I said earlier, my favourite shot is this shrub with the berries on, which I think gives a very good indication of the capability of the lens. It's a teeny bit out of focus, but even so, I don't think it's going to be the sharpest lens even for a camera of this age. Nonetheless, it's a nice picture in my view, and if you want to experiment with vintage cameras, and especially film cameras, and get that vintage analog film look, I think that really does show it's a film camera. You couldn't easily replicate that sort of style digitally. You could do, but it's not an easy thing to do particularly. Oh, one last one, or a couple of others in actual fact, just to give an indication of depth of field and sharpness. Here's a church, or a chapel in actual fact. Quite sharp at reasonable distance. As you get further from the camera, of course, depth of field is more, focusing accuracy is less critical. And then a couple of pictures of an interesting stone wall or brick wall. Slightly irregular construction of this wall, which attracted me to it, and it just gives an idea of the resolution of the lens in some way. So there we go, that's the Isolette Mk II. Should you buy one? Well, it's up to you really. It is a very inexpensive way to get into medium format photography. This particular one cost me, I believe, £13, and as you can see, it's in terrific condition. Really does seem to be a nicely made camera. If you have a little experience in film photography, I wouldn't recommend it as a first camera or starter camera. I did find in using it, it was a little more challenging than some others. You do have to, there's very little help in terms of automation. In fact, there's no automation of any kind, so you really do have to remember to wind on, to cock the shutter, to set the focus. It'll be very easy, for example, to take a picture of a dry stone wall and focus on that, and then take a picture of a wider scene and forget to focus or forget to readjust the focus to infinity. So you really do have to think a little bit more carefully. If you are going to get any sort of a bellows camera, it's worth taking time to examine the bellows and look for any what they call pinprick holes, little tiny holes where where it's folded in and out over the years. This might have worn through. Doesn't seem to be an issue on this one. One way you can do that is by shining a light inside the camera in a dark room and looking for little pinpricks of light coming through the bellows themselves. Anyway, that sums it up for the Isolette. Thank you for watching, I do appreciate it, and do have a nice day.